topic of my presentation today is Leonardo da Vinci and the Search for the Soul. And a number of individuals have asked me, why this quest for the search for the soul? Why this question, my interest in Leonardo da Vinci, and particularly this idea related to Leonardo's interest in the location of the soul? Well, I think I can blame it on Professor Jaroslav Havelka. When I was an intern, Dr. Havelka, professor of psychology at King's College at Western University, was giving a course related to creativity and the issues associated with creativity. And that happened to be one of my interests at that time, and it continues to be one of my major interests now. Professor Havelka believed that Mozart was the most, let's say, creative person that had ever lived. And the reason for that related to the fact that when you looked at Mozart's music and you looked at how Mozart composed his music, there were very few changes. In other words, it almost looked like the music actually came right out of his sort of intellectual sort of consciousness. And Leonardo and Dr. Havelka felt that this was sort of the basic conceptualization of creativity. Now, a couple things. He spoke 9 languages. He was an artist. 2 things that he particularly drew and painted were the suffering of man and trees, nature. And combine those 2 issues together. To pass his course, one had to pick another individual who was not Mozart. And then in a series of 2 interviews, try to convince the professor why your champion was better than Mozart. Now you have to remember, this is a time period when I'm an intern, quite busy as you might imagine. And I decided at that time to choose Leonardo da Vinci. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I did choose Leonardo da Vinci. And I went forward with 2 interviews. At the end of the second interview, he did pass me. His basic belief was, he didn't believe in Marx whatsoever. He only gave a pass or a fail. He did pass me, but it was clear in his discussions with me that taking on a personality like Leonardo da Vinci, that I could have done much, much better than in my presentations to him. So I think in one way, Professor Havelka sort of convinced me that there was something missing in my understanding of Leonardo, and I could do better. So part of this sort of 50 years or so, sort of attempt to understand Leonardo and various concepts of creativity is based on the fact that I'd like to get a better mark. So you all can give me a mark at the end of this and see if I'm doing better now than I did when I started. Another way of looking at this issue relates to understanding it in a more modern way would be Leonardo da Vinci in the search for the composites of consciousness rather than the conceptualization of the soul. Now, when one thinks about Leonardo da Vinci, I think Paul Valéry, a French poet, really put it together in the best possible way. Writing of Leonardo, he said, what a man or a person leaves after them are the dreams that their name inspires and the works that make their name a symbol of admiration. If one considers the world to be a poem in some way, then to the poetry of medicine, Leonardo contributed a number of poems, very few, in fact. To the poetry of art, Leonardo contributed a number of volumes. To the poetry of the world, Leonardo contributed whole libraries of thought and understanding. Now, Leonardo's neurological focus was the soul, the sense of communal, but it wasn't a religious concept. It basically was, in his conceptualization, was the interpreter of our existence and the essence of our passion and intellectual life. So in essence, not a religious concept, but maybe more of a concept of consciousness and the parts of what consciousness is made up of. Leonardo's question was, in which organ do the composites of consciousness reside? And this has to do with a very complex dualism question, one that I certainly struggle with, and I think everybody struggles with. And that is, how does matter, the atoms and other, the other things that make up us as humans, create the subjective experience of mind? How does that occur? How does these atoms that connect us and make us who we are really create what our mind is, what our consciousness is? Complex question. Goals of my presentation are three. I'm going to look at some of the sources of this ancient question related to the position of the soul and the idea of consciousness. I'm going to talk about the knowledge base that Leonardo tapped for his personal search for the soul. And I'm going to talk a little bit about modern concepts related to composites of consciousness, various concepts and ideas about what consciousness is and how it can be looked at and studied. If we start at the time of the Egyptians, writings include the actions of the arms, the movements of the legs, the motion of every other member is done according to the orders of the heart that has conceived them. It is the heart that draws from the senses every judgment, and the tongue pronounces that which the heart has thought. After one dies and was embalmed, the organs were removed from the body and placed in these small sort of containers. One organ, however, was not removed from the body, and that was the heart. However, the brain was removed very quickly. Excerptation is an Egyptian mummification procedure of removal of the brain from the corpse prior to the actual embalming. The Greek writer Herodotus, who was a frequent visitor to Egypt, wrote, having agreed on a price, the bearers go away, and the workmen, left alone in their place, embalm the body. If they do this in a perfect way, they first draw out of the brain through the nostrils with an iron hook and inject certain drugs into the rest. So these are examples of the iron hooks that were used. And this, interesting enough, is an X-ray of a mummy in which the iron hook was actually broken during the removal of the brain. And you can see that they went through the nose into the brain area, would put in various compounds that would dissolve the brain, and then the brain would just be removed out. So clearly, from the point of view of the Egyptians, the brain had very, very little value, and the heart clearly was the most important. The reason for this? Well, the reason was that after death, there was a very interesting concept, an idea, which was called the weighing of the feather. The heart was weighed against a special feather of Ma. So you can see here there's a weighing scale. On one side, there's a feather, and on the other side, there's that particular individual's heart. The feather of Ma was a symbol of universal truth, harmony, and balance. If that individual's heart weighed less than the feather, in other words, it was unburdened by evil deeds, then that individual's spirit will live for eternity. However, if that patient's heart was heavy with sin and weighed more than the feather, then that person's heart would be consumed by the devourer. This is the devourer here. He would just wait and be ready to consume that heart. The concept of linking the judgment of one's heart, in other words, whether you did good or bad deeds, to an eternal existence after death, profoundly influenced the Western concept of intellectual function, religion, and philosophy. You can see here this concept of good and evil, and the idea of, potentially the idea of heaven and hell, are all related to this very concept associated with this weighing of the feather. Now, there was another interesting concept here. Anubis, which is this little guy here, is sometimes shown adjusting the balance. You see here, he's sort of adjusting the balance a little bit in favor of the deceased to ensure that that particular individual made it into the underworld and survived forever. So again, despite the fact that there was good and evil, there were other influences that were also occurring at the same time to decide where that individual was going to go. Interestingly, in the Egyptian language hieroglyphics, the symbol for the soul is a lamb's heart, you can see here. And later, when writing became more common, again, you can see that we start with a symbolic picture of the soul and a lamb's heart, and then it goes on, changes. Amulets associated with the picture of a lamb's heart, the structure of a lamb's heart was very commonly associated with the Egyptian time period. So you can sort of understand this really strong concept related to the fact that the heart was the most important aspect of our sort of existence and life and passion. Now I want to move very quickly here to the Renaissance. And the reason I'm moving to the Renaissance is that Rafael Sanchez in the School of Athens, in the center part, has two individuals. This, as you can see here, is Plato. He's carrying the Timaeus, which we'll talk about a little bit, but he actually is shown as Leonardo da Vinci. And you can see that Leonardo is pointing upwards really to draw the sort of spirit of God into the painting. This is Aristotle, who happens to be Plato's student, and he's carrying the Ethics. It's difficult to know who this really is, and there's been a lot of thought about that. My own personal feeling is it has to be Michelangelo, just because on one side you have Leonardo, on the other side you have Michelangelo. Now, Plato, very important aspect of developing conceptually this idea of how the brain functions and how sort of the world functions related to what is important. And he asks the question, is the blood the element with which we think, or the air, or the fire? Clearly, multiple philosophers have made all these sort of claims. He comes up with a concept. But the brain may be the originating power of the perceptions of hearing and sight and smell and memory and opinion may come from them, and science may be based on memory and opinion when they have been attained fixity. So in essence, three ideas. One, our world is made up of the external sensations that we get from our eyes, our nose, our ears, our taste, our feelings, our skin. Reasoning results from action based on the information that continually comes into our body. And memory is what has been sensed previously and sort of is like a modulator, allow us to understand what this new sensation may be or what it isn't. So in essence, three things: external sensations, reasoning from those sensations, and then memory that adds and continually sort of changes our perception of reality. Now, Aristotle came up with quite a different concept. Aristotle did multiple examinations of animals, particularly amphibians and other animals. And he says, the brain in all animals is bloodless, devoid of veins, and naturally cold to the touch. And you can see the idea that he was dissecting many animals that were full-blooded. In the great majority of animals, it has a small hollow in the center, which you know now are the ventricles. However, Aristotle was an incredibly keen observer and did multiple experiments associated with the chick and the development of the chick. He comments, when he was looking at chick development and he watched the chick development over time, he mentions and puts forward the concept that the heart was the very first thing that could be seen during the development of the chick. And therefore, since it was seen first, it must be the most important part of development. Since why would it not be the most important part? Because it is seen first, sort of a circular type of argument. And he said, this point beats and moves as though endowed with life. If you look at this, here's a injection into the system of a chick embryo. And you can see here in the corner, the heart beating. So you can see Aristotle watching and trying to understand how life begins and how life continues to develop associated with embryology. That seeing this particular beating heart clearly had a very, very strong influence on him and a strong influence on many of his followers. So others, however, did not follow that particular concept related to the heart as more important. And Hippocrates comments on the sacred disease. The sacred disease is epilepsy. I'm about to discuss the disease called sacred. It is not, in my opinion, any more divine or more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause. The fact is, the cause of this affliction, as of most serious afflictions, is the brain. As for this disease called divine, surely it has its nature and causes, as have other diseases. All have their antecedent causes, which can be found by those who seek them. So conceptually, you can see how Hippocrates sort of puts forward this sort of idea that there are natural causes for disease, and these natural causes can be found and can be learned. And really, conceptually, one of the reasons why medicine exists the way it does at the present time. Galen, who was the doctor to the gladiators, Roman times, was able to see multiple different types of injuries that occurred during gladiator combat, but he also carried out multiple types of experiments. He comments, when a nerve is cut, pinched, contused, or tied by a ligature, all motion and sensitivity is suspended. So great is the power descending through the nerve from its great source above the brain. For whatever is above the section of the nerve and continuous with the brain, this still will preserve the activity coming from its cerebral source. But what is lower will be unable to exercise sensation or motion. So he carries out a number of experiments to try to, again, understand this concept of the brain and how the brain functions. His final comment is really this. This is, therefore, we agree with Plato and Hippocrates, and contrary to Aristotle and Graecus, many others, that the brain is a source of voluntary motion and the heart of another involuntary motion. So in Leonardo's time, there were two basic concepts. The one was the cardiocentric, and the most prominent of those was Aristotle, but it involved the Stoics and many others. Then there was the cephalocentric component, really strongly supported by Plato, who, interestingly enough, was Aristotle's teacher, and Hippocrates and others. Now, moving on to Leonardo, Giorgio Vasari, writing about Leonardo, comments, in the natural course of events, celestial influences rain down on human beings, the greatest of gifts, but sometimes, in a way that transcends nature, bestows on a single individual beauty, grace, ability, united with such lavish abundance that every action he takes, everything he turns his attention to, is so divine that it surpasses all other men, clearly demonstrating that this genius is a gift from God, rather than being an acquirement of human art. So in Vasari's concept about Leonardo, in one way he was a gift from God. His abilities were that, something that was more celestial in its origin. Leonardo was born out of wedlock. His father had very little interest in him. He probably never went to school because he was dominantly left-handed. And there's no way that nuns at that time don't let anybody be right with their left hand, because in the Italian language, left is sinistra, which comes from sinister. So the left hand is sinistra. And therefore, at that particular time frame, there was a very strong concept that no one should write with that sinistra or sinister left hand. And he would have been changed to be a right hand. But when he was about 13 or 14 years old, he goes into the studio as an apprentice to an individual named Verrocchio. Now, in that time period, initially, he would have, for example, done lots of drawings of various statues and other objects. As he grew, he would have been involved in, let's say, making various types of pigments for the pictures that would have to be made. If he was very good, he might have been allowed to actually make some of the backgrounds involving some of the paintings that the master would have been doing at the time. And then if the master really liked his work, he may have been able to do some of the figures, and there's a whole sort of conceptualization related to this. And at some point I'll get into it, people would like. However, in the first edition of Vasari's book on Leonardo, he says, Leonardo was of a heretical cast of mind, that it conformed with no religion whatsoever, counting it perchance much better to be a philosopher than a Christian. Now one has to remember that this is a time of the Renaissance. This is a time of all kinds of various types of corruption and other things associated with the Catholic Church. And Leonardo was very spiritual in many different ways. I didn't go into that. He was a vegetarian, for example. It was common that he would go into the markets, buy all the birds and let them go. And at the time of his death, he clearly was interested in going on to another existence. However, the whole concept of the religion at that time was not something that he was particularly interested in. So if we start with Leonardo's search for the soul, I've broken this up into phases. The first phase is really experimentation. And this occurred in Leonardo's first Milanese period. He's about 35 years old at this time. And Leonardo was really, for predominantly artistic purposes, initiated a series of investigations focused on deciphering the physiology of vision and perception, and really involved a series of anatomical experiments. This initial phase really allowed Leonardo to both integrate and visually reconstruct information that he obtained from a number of sources. Leonardo had a very large library and used the books in this library for many of his sort of intellectual explorations. And near the end of his life, he is noted to have at least 116 items. And they were a wide range of books that he owned. This, however, did not include many of the other books that Leonardo knew about and read and had knowledge of. So Leonardo's first really sort of assimilation is assimilating knowledge that other people have already produced. One of these individuals that was particularly interesting to him was Albertus Magnus. Now, Albertus Magnus had a very early conception of what was necessary to carry out experimentation. And really, it was really through Albertus Magnus that Leonardo became aware of many of the anatomical explorations of Aristotle and the concepts that had a very important influence on Leonardo's anatomical explorations in his search for the location of the human soul. This is the first woodcut associated with soul that occurs in Albertus Magnus's book, 14.9. And you can see there are three sort of circles inside the brain. And this again goes back to the idea of Plato. Sensations, concepts were associated with integration and reasoning, and the third being memory. Now, at that particular time period, there was a lot of interest in Rome and Hannibal, especially the idea that Hannibal would cross the Alps with a series of elephants and had attacked the Romans. Now, you can see at the top here that the elephants had sort of a driver, this individual at the top here. All of them had these individuals. Leonardo's reading and writing this down in one of his notebooks. The scalp roll was a sharpened iron used to break and control elephants. Livy, in the 7th book of the Carchilasian Wars, says that many more elephants were killed by their own governors than by the enemy. For when the beast got enraged with them, the governor, with a mighty blow, thrust a sharp scalpel between the ears where the neck joins the spinal column, and this was the most rapid death that could be given to such a huge beast. Leonardo must have been quite impressed with this. Here's this huge beast that all you have to do is put this scalpel that was about, let's say, 12 inches long between the cranium and the spinal cord, and suddenly this large animal would be dead. The second thing, Roberto Voltario really describes this instrument, and Leonardo writes about it, really copying directly from Voltario's work. And he basically was very interested in another book called De Re Militari that was written by Roberto. And this book was used really in both combining Latin versions and Italian translations that he had to try to understand more about this information about how these animals were killed. So even in our own mythology, so again, the mythology of the idea of being able to take down a large animal like an elephant was clearly very influential in Leonardo's thinking. This is the very first pages of drawings that we have by Leonardo. And under ultraviolet, you can see here, for example, that there's the legs with muscles, bones, nerves. Leonardo must have been doing many experiments before he ever got to this stage. However, in the corner here, very interesting. In the corner, we have the base of the skull, the spinal cord, C1, and various writings around it. And this happens to be of a frog. Leonardo writes, when the See? Basically, when the frog lives without its head or its heart and all its bowels, and if you puncture the said nerve, the spinal medulla, it immediately twitches and dies. You see the spinal cord here. All the nerves of animals derive here, spinal cord here. When this is pricked, the animal dies at once. This is Leonardo's typical sort of right to left writing. Here, interestingly enough, however, he's writing correctly. He's writing from left to right. He says, sense of touch, cause of motion, origin of the nerves, passage for the animal power, nerve power. Probably writing directly from some book or parts of from some book. When you turn the page over, this is what you see. Sort of like a compendium of all kinds of drawings. Leonardo says he copies what he has on the other side and says, the frog instantly dies when its spinal medulla oblongata, is perforated. And previously it had lived without head, without heart, or any interior organs, or intestines or skin. Here, therefore, it appears lies the foundation of movement and life. So somehow he moves from the concept that it is not the heart, but if you can kill a large animal like an elephant and doing his own experiments, he begins to clearly come to the idea that there's something much more important than the heart. His mind happens to be the brain. If you look up here in the corner, there's another picture that basically is somewhat the same. You can see here again, some base of the skull, spinal cord, C1. Here's some nerves. See them here, for example. Leonardo writes here, right in here. It's hard to decipher because it's unclear. Either the dog or the arm will be lost, whichever of these nerves is punctured. So if we can reconstruct Leonardo's methodology, the conceptual methodology Leonardo employed used to carry out this scientific exploration is very evident when one reconstructs this critical experiment, this pithing experiment of the frog. The location of the place in the body to be pith came from information that he had abstracted from Livy's account. The instrument came from Roberto Vittorio, and the expected result from the experiment was also derived from Livy. So in other words, he had the information from these individuals and really basically did an experiment to really prove that this information was correct. However, Leonardo needed to modify the experimental, taking into account that he was dealing with a very different animal, a much smaller frog. He therefore had to design his scalpel so that it could be employed to carry out his proposed studies. Leonardo had to carry out an initial series of studies to understand the anatomy of the frog's foramen magnum and his cranial base and all the upper spinal cord. And Leonardo had to repeat the experiment to make sure it was true. So in one way, he constructs the whole sort of conceptualization, looks into the literature, finds out about how this particular experiment could be done. He then designs the experiment, he does the experiment, then he repeats it. Really the whole experimental method. This experiment wasn't done again until about 150 years later. It gives you some idea of Leonardo's sort of advancement related to his thinking processes associated with the idea of how to do an experiment. Now, Leonardo had in his conceptualization the idea that he would write numerous books. But one of the books had to do with physiology. And in that particular book, he was going to obviously talk about the soul. Now, the soul is of nature, which is necessary, makes the vital and actual instruments of suitable and necessary shapes and positions. In other words, nature is involved in making the human. what he is or what she is. How necessary is the companion of nature? So what he's thinking about here, represent from whence comes the semen, whence the urine, whence the milk, how nourishment proceeds to distribute itself through the veins, whence comes intoxication, whence vomiting, whence gravel and stone, whence colic, whence dreaming. Interesting that Leonardo would be thinking about dreaming in this situation. And then he comes back to a very interesting concept that goes back to the frog. Why is it that compressing the arteries of the neck, a man falls asleep? Why is it that a prick on the neck may cause a man to drop dead? Leonardo had been involved in numbers of battles associated with him, his travels, and clearly had seen these types of injuries, and then can link what he has done with the frog and what happens in the human condition. During this time period, Leonardo hasn't done any experiments related to actual human dissection. And you can see from these drawings, for example, here Leonardo is using again the idea of the three sort of ideas. Here's memory at the back. Here is, for example, sensorineural in the middle, and the auditory and the olfactory nerves are going into it. But you can see here that the optic nerves actually go through the eyes. He's just conceptualizing, drawing from what the knowledge that he's picked up from other books. But he then begins to move these objects around in three-dimensional space to try to get a better idea about them. The second phase really involves Leonardo's really focus on defining anatomical concepts which are linked to his studies on proportion. And Leonardo at that time had access not only to a series of human skulls, but also to a publication. And that publication was Mondino's Anatomical Thesis, and in an Italian edition of Ketton's Fasciculus Manual on Human Dissection. Now, why Italian is important is that Leonardo never really had a grasp of Latin. And therefore, since this particular book was written in Italian, he was able to sort of understand the idea of how to actually do a dissection. When you look at this book, this is what the book looks like. So this would have been sort of an anatomical book published at that particular time period. So this is what Leonardo had to deal with when he tried to understand what was going on. And you can see here that there's not really much really anatomical knowledge, but conceptually you can see that there's information that Leonardo now has to draw on to do some of his next experiments. So again, Leonardo starts conceptualizing what this might be. So in this particular drawing, Leonardo's further synthesis really involves, he's got theories related to Avicenna, Albertus Magnus, Mondino, a French surgeon, Guy de Chauliac. Leonardo basically uses the analogy of an onion. So you can see here, this is an onion here. And from the onion, where you can peel the onion, Leonardo is able to explain the various layers of the scalp, the dura, the arachnoid, the pia, and gets basic a concept of what the surface of the brain is about. You can see here, this is the first time the frontal sinus is shown here. And again, you can see that these three little nodules here, these cavities, they're really empty spaces, three balloon-like tubes. But Leonardo, again, has this ability to look at three dimensions. So if you look at the bottom view here he has the picture cut through here, and he actually flips it over. And again, you can see now he has the eyes, the optic nerves, and then these three sort of cavities again, these balloon-like cavities again. This is really Leonardo's attempt in really a visual form to sort of put together what's called the cell doctrine, these three areas, this area associated with sensation, rational sort of thinking and memory coming together. Now, Leonardo has a series of skulls that he has access to, and he begins to do what are cutaway views. However, despite the fact that he's doing some very interesting cutaway views, why is he doing them? He writes, the cavity of the eye socket and the cavity of the bone that supports the cheek and that of the nose and mouth are equal depth and terminate within a perpendicular line below the sensor communion. So part of the reason for these proportional drawings involving the skull is to actually find out where is the location of the soul actually within the skull. These are some of the, this is a three-dimensional reconstruction I had done of a human skull. And this is the cutaway view that you can see here. And you can also see that Leonardo, in one way, does a much better job. You can see the frontal sinus, the eye socket, the maxillary sinus, teeth, etc. And again, you can see the beauty of the cutaway view. However, Leonardo always believed of the importance of the eye. And he comments, the eye, which is called the window of the soul, is the chief means whereby the understanding may most fully and abundantly appreciate the infinite works of nature. And the ear is the second, inasmuch as it acquires its importance from the fact that it hears the things that the eye has seen. So again, conceptually, concept of the eye and the visual information that one gets from that particular sense. Leonardo, having access to the skull, begins to make a series of drawings to try to sort of locate where the sense of communion would be. And he locates it just behind the optic nerves, comments, where the line AM intersects by the line C6. There's the meaning of the senses is made. You see right in here. He then has the ability to do studies associated with the fact that some of the actual nerves are intact. So here, for example, you can see another drawing where again, he's again using these diagonal lines, but here's the optic nerves. Here's some of the other cavernous sinuses here, some of the other nerves, the meningeal blood vessels. And again, Leonardo places the soul in this area, the area of the hypothalamus, which is clearly a very important area of the human brain. Again, Leonardo's drawing an MR scan, and I can tell you, if you happen to have a tumor in that area, you have a great deal of trouble interacting with your environment in any meaningful way. Leonardo then really comes into a military idea concerning how the actual brain works. He comments, therefore, the joint between the bones obeys the tendon, almost a military concept, and the tendon, the muscle, and the muscle, the nerve, and the nerve, the senso communis. And the senso communis is the seat of the soul. Memories it's stored, and impressiva is its standard of reference. And the heart is its, Leonardo doesn't add a word here. Even in his own notes, he's either having difficulty conceptualizing, writing the word heart, in this case, everybody ever looked at it, or he's still not quite sure related to that concept. In the last part, Leonardo's search of the soul is what I noted as phase 3. And this third phase really involved investigations that he carried out near the end of his life, where he was very concentrated on neurological studies and cerebral anatomy, in particular on the brain's ventricular system. These studies resulted in the integration of many investigations that he had done before in some type of fundamental sort of system. The first thing he attacks is this. I have to say, if you ever have a chance to actually see Leonardo's drawings in real life, they are quite different than I can show you in these particular photographs. They have a real three-dimensional quality. The fact that he's doing the underlining between them, the way it's put together. Most of Leonardo's drawings associated with the human body are also associated with his writing. He's writing all the time. Here, for example, how the finger moves, the tendons and all the bones, etc. And so, although I can give you an appreciation of what Leonardo's work is like, if you ever have a chance to actually see it, please do, because you'll get a completely different visualization of what it is all about. Leonardo writes, "The soul appears to reside in the seat of judgment, and the judicial part appears to be where all the senses come together, which is called the sense of community. It is not all of it everywhere in the whole body, as many believed, but all in this part. There are a number of philosophers, Democritus and others, who would believe that the soul is distributed through the whole body. And Leonardo did not believe in that concept. He basically did not believe in the concept that the soul was distributed, but it was located, or this part of the consciousness was not distributed throughout the whole body. Let's put it that way. These are some of Leonardo's drawings of the heart. And in the end, he basically feels that it is a very, very efficient machine, but still an efficient machine. You can see, for example, the valves, the coronary vessels, etc. Leonardo does very careful experiments and investigations. He says, ease away the brain substance from the borders of the dura mater, which is interposed between the basilar bone and the brain substance, and you will acquire such knowledge with certainty when you diligently raise to pia mater little by little. So here you see the eyes, the optic nerves, the olfactory nerves, chiasm. So you can see that Leonardo is slowly gaining more and more information. This is sort of an interesting group of experiments in which Leonardo really wants to find out, what does the ventricular system really look like? He's seen it in books, he's never. And so what he does a group of experiments where he actually makes two vent holes in the horns of the greater ventricles and inserts melted wax with a syringe, making a hole in the ventricle of memory. So in other words, he injects right here into the base of the third ventricle, fills the ventricular system with wax, and then removes the brain surface. And you can see the lateral ventricles, the foramen of Monro, the third ventricle, the aqueduct of Sylvius, and the fourth ventricle. So for the very first time, a three-dimensional structure of the whole ventricular system is put together. So now he's looking more into the idea of how does this really work? And there are many sort of other drawings that occur at that time and after, but you can see that there's sort of, again, the three sort of whole concepts: memory at the back, imagination and reasoning, but not in any real structural form, as Leonardo's been able to do. Then as far as integration is concerned, he starts integrating the pictures, the ventricular system, the base of the skull, the optic nerves, the nerves going into the face, etc., and comes up with sort of a composite drawing of the whole system. And he actually names the various nerves coming away from the base of the skull, the olfactory, etc. Then Leonardo turns his attention to a different concept. And the concept really is, when does the soul of the mother pass into the child? Leonardo had the ability to dissect a child in the uterus, a mother who had died. And his interest is really associated with that concept. When does the soul go from the mother to the child? When does the soul appear? When does consciousness appear? When does this whole idea of the human really appear? And he says, and she puts there the soul, the composer of the body, that is the soul of the mother, which first composes in the womb the shape of man, and in due time awakens the soul, which is to be its inhabitant. So the idea being this transfer that occurs from the mother to the child associated with this soul, this consciousness that we're talking about here. And he goes on, the human ingenuity by various inventions with different instruments yields the same end. It will never devise an invention more beautiful than does nature, because in her inventions, nothing is lacking and nothing is superfluous. Very almost Darwinian type of concept. And here's my daughter with Everly, granddaughter. And I can honestly tell you, it's still an amazing thing to me, the idea of birth and the ability of the human race to reproduce itself, and the concept of when does consciousness travel from the mother to the child? How does this miracle really happen and work? As we move on, after Leonardo's death, Vesalius, for example, tackled the problem too. And he was not at all happy with the whole concept. He comments, I have not forgotten how, when I was following the philosophical course in the Castile School, Aristotle's thesis on the soul was read to us by our teachers. In other words, at that time, the actual teachers would read the actual book, because obviously the students wouldn't have copies. An illustration was shown us, taken from some philosophical pearl, and that relates to some of the books that were called philosophical pearl, presenting to our eyes the aforementioned ventricles, which each of us studied very carefully and as an exercise, and adding a drawing of it to our notes. And that was the drawing of the three circles. We were persuaded that this figure included not only the three ventricles, but also, as we were led to believe, it displayed all parts of the head, including the brain. Descartes, in his book De Humani, made a complete break from this really medieval tradition of the cell doctrine, these three sort of areas that had been based really on Plato's concept of a three-part soul. Descartes localized the soul in the pineal gland, based on his concept that the body was a machine. Because only one soul was needed to run this mechanical body, he dispersed with other possible sites for the soul, the heart, the abdomen, etc. Thomas Willis really disagreed with Descartes that the pineal gland was the seat of the soul, but he was an important member of the iconoclasts, chemists, a group of researchers who believed that chemical rather than mechanical concepts were essential to the human function. In De Cerebri Anatomica, as you can outline here, he outlined a new concept that in some ways the choroid plexus was involved in absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid, for example. Now, this is the first microscopic image of a nerve cell. You can see here we have a nucleus, we have nucleolus, and we have some structure within that particular cell. Here we have the Purkinje cell, which was really the first identifiable nerve cell in the nervous system. But again, you can see it's pretty primitive in its concept. Now, Golgi really just sort of considered the brain to be a reticulum. In other words, every cell in the brain was connected to the other cells, and the whole system functioned as sort of one computer with a bunch of lines and cables throughout the system. So that was basically his conceptualization. Cajal, on the other hand, sort of felt and proved in the end that each nerve cell was separate and communicated with other cells, but was separate. Both of these individuals got the Nobel Prize. Golgi, to the end of his life, really did not change, but clearly Cajal's idea dominated. And the neuron became the physiological unit of the human brain. So we have the neuron, the dendrites, the axon, etc., as being the physiological unit. And so if you look at levels of organization of the nervous system, we start at the bottom with molecules and atoms. However, my son is a theoretical physicist, and I can tell you, he'll tell you that it's actually the atoms and how the atoms are actually moving, the electrons are moving, and the atoms are interacting that is related to the very essence of the story. But we can move on to molecules. We can have synapses, microcircuits, dendritic trees, then the neurons, local circuits, integrated systems, behavioral systems, and therefore we know, right? Right? Okay. Where does love come from in this system? Where does caring come from? Where is humanity in this complex system of neurons and behavioral systems? One can argue, for example, that the reason that we have love, for example, is because we have to reproduce ourselves as a species. But how does that really explain an individual whose, let's say, wife is dying from Alzheimer's and spends this loving, caring moments feeding her and taking care of her, or the other way around? How does that have anything to do with reproduction in any way, shape, or form? How does love come about? How do we understand that? Well, you can stimulate the brain, and I can tell you can stimulate it everywhere you want. You're not going to get much love out of that. People like Penfield worked on this sort of concept of really stimulating the brain in many different areas. And where was consciousness? And at the end, he basically comes up with the concept that the indispensable substrate of consciousness lies outside of the cerebral cortex, probably in the diencephalon. In other words, what he's saying is it's not in the surface of the brain, in the white matter and gray matter structures in the surface of the brain, but deeper down inside the brain. What I can tell you is when you operate on a awake patient, brain, rather remarkably, the interpreter of brain and the interpreter of pain in the universe has no pain fibers. How did that evolve? What advantage could that have been to an evolving species? So one can operate on patients who are completely awake. During those operations, you can have computers in front of them. They can do all kinds of complex mathematics and other things. And so you don't damage those types of activities related to their human condition while you take out, let's say, a brain tumor. I'm just going to mention artificial intelligence. Most of you are aware of it. But really, the reason I'm putting it forward is the concept that consciousness has really incorporated this idea of artificial intelligence. And so artificial intelligence is a branch of computer science dealing with simulations of intelligent behavior in computers. Machine learning is this domain of artificial intelligence that allows computer algorithms to learn patterns by studying data directly without being programmed. So our brain being programmed? Is during youth, the time period where programming occurs. We can think about different ways of considering artificial intelligence, machine learning, the artificial neural networks, etc. In 1989, BARS came up with an idea related to one of the first sort of interesting and, let's say, more comprehensive concepts related to consciousness. And it basic is called the global workspace theory. This theory argues that consciousness arises from a particular type of information processing related to concepts of artificial intelligence. So sensory and other information, in other words, we get back to the old sensory information, involves small programs of data, which are shared and then written onto this blackboard of our brain. And consciousness emerges when the incoming sensory input inscribed on such a blackboard is broadcast from the frontal parietal lobes through all the multiple cognitive systems. And when this process happens, the data to speak, to store or call up memory begins to execute a function. In other words, this is what consciousness is when this broadcasting of information occurs. And if you think about it, if you think about, for example, that you're dreaming and suddenly you become awake, that's to give you an idea of what the sort of idea is, that during this dreaming time period, your brain is beginning to sort of use all kinds of information. And when it gets to a certain level, then you're awake. The interesting part of this idea, however, is this idea predicts that in the future, computers will be conscious because it's sensory-based and program-based. Another individual basically considers the idea that consciousness is really a spectrum. And one can start at a very high focus, for example. And that high focus is when you're doing algebra, very complex mathematics, etc. Then there's this medium focus when your brain is doing, talking and doing other kinds of activities. And then there's this very strange focus where you're daydreaming. This funny time period between the time you go to bed and the time you actually fall asleep. This time when the brain is actually doing all kinds of interesting things because you're using just as much energy at that time as you use at any other time during the day. And his idea basically is that computers can never become conscious because they can't dream. They don't have this down phase where we as humans have it all the time, every time we go to sleep. The second strong theory relates to what's called the integrated information theory. And this theory is derived from an underlying interconnected structure. What base it is, it's the structure itself is important. In this non-negative number pi, this qualifies consciousness. If that number is 0, in other words, if you have a stone, that system does not feel like anything to be itself. In other words, it's 0. However, the bigger the number, the more intrinsic causal power that particular system has, and therefore the more conscious it is. Next, an example is the octopus. The octopus has its own brain, but each of its arms also have a brain. So you put all that information together and you give it some type of number, but that number is not high enough to become conscious. So that it's a spectrum here again, spectrum from 1 to whatever consciousness happens to be. The brain, because of its neuronal complexity, is very high, and therefore would have a conscious high number. The interesting thing about this theory, however, is the theory predicts that a sophisticated simulation of the brain running on computers cannot be conscious. In other words, you will never get a computer to be conscious. The idea lies in the concept that consciousness cannot be programmed. It has to be built into the system. As we talked about related to Leonardo's concept, is when does the soul go from the mother to the child? The system actually is built in to be conscious. It's not programmed to be conscious, it's built in. So what can I tell you? Well, from my experience, I can tell you a few things. One, it seems to me that you have two components. You have consciousness and you have content to consciousness. In other words, the top part of the brain here is involved in your conscious ability to interact with your environment, to gain sensory information, to do all those types of things. However, consciousness, however, is based on a much deeper system, the reticular formation that happens to be in the brainstem. So you can actually have no content to your consciousness here, but you can still be awake. Your eyes will still follow individuals in the room. You'll have wake sleep cycles. but you will not have any content to your consciousness. So it appears you need two things. You need to be conscious, but you also have to have content to allow that consciousness to sort of integrate with the outside world. Second, it's quite amazing that memory is located in two temporal lobes and almost completely duplicated. So clearly memory is so important that through evolution, we developed two temporal lobes to completely duplicate all the memories that we have. So every time we have a memory and we encode that memory, usually at night, memory is encoded in two temporal lobes. Again, understanding that how important memory function must be related to the system. If you look at Leonardo's drawings, this is the hypothalamus area, and it has many important structural areas. Control the pituitary gland, control our ability to control our internal temperatures, and many other very important aspects associated with memory. The memory bodies, for example, here, the back here are associated with memory. If you damage the memory bodies, you will not remember how to find any room in your house. You locate all your intermediate memory is gone. So you will not remember anything about what you did today or anything you did yesterday. So in one way, there are important areas that are here. And so Leonardo's concepts of where the sort of seat of the soul or conscious has some value there. I give this example because I find it interesting. There were two groups of individuals, two large research groups. They were working on developing the human genome in the late 20th century. One group was involved with each group taking one chromosome and multiple universities being associated with it. A second group was organized by an individual by the name of Venter, and these were machines. These were machines who were doing exactly the same thing, but doing it very, very quickly and efficiently, and that's basically what has taken over, of course. They both came out with the data at about the same time. And there was a lot of discussion at the time that they would publish in the same journal. And they could not get it together to do that. So one was published in Nature, one was published in Science in exactly the same week, which makes it interesting that we as humans, even then we're deciphering the actual human genome, can't get it together to put the information into one particular book or one poem. Now, this is updated, of course, but we know the function of multiple genes. But there are certain genes that we have no idea what they do. So clearly, some of these genes are involved in the interactions that we have that allow us to have caring, love, and other sort of human types of characteristics. And eventually, these interactions will be more clear-cut as these particular genes are identified how we change these genes during development and develop our personalities and other aspects. But this is in the future, and many of you will probably maybe be involved in it, but it is going to take some time because these interactions are going to be extremely complex. Now, at one time, what's going to happen when we operate on people is we're going to have much more information about the brain and how it works. And our memory engrams and all those aspects of what we are will be able to be put into some type of computer-based systems. Walter Penfield said, the problem of neurology is to understand man himself. Venter, this is this individual that was associated with using the machines to develop the genome, comments, the ultimate use of the human genome information. The real challenge of human biology beyond the task of finding out how genes orchestrate the construction and maintenance of the miraculous mechanisms of our bodies, will lie ahead as we seek to explain how our minds have come to organize thought sufficiently well to investigate our own existence. Leonardo says, what moves you, man, to abandon your home in town and leave relatives and friends, going into the country places, over mountains and up valleys, but not the natural beauty of the world? Jean Piaget, psychologist, comments, the principal goal of education in schools should be creating men and women who are capable of doing new things, not simply repeating what other generations have done before. Men and women who are creative, inventive, discoverers, who can be critical and verify and not accept everything they are afforded. Leonardo wrote, it is a mediocre pupil who does not excel his master. Now, Leonardo had multiple students, none of which excelled him. Clearly, he's an outlier. I changed that around a little bit. It is a mediocre teacher whose pupils do not excel him or her. So our role and your role in the future when you have pupils is to make those pupils better than you are. And if you have been able to do so, then clearly you have mastered a particular skill. And that skill is moving knowledge from one generation to another in such a way that it is useful to make the world a better place. Paul Valery said, what a person leaves after them are the dreams that their name inspires and the works that make their name a symbol of admiration. The search continues. Thank you very much. Thank you. Questions? Kyla, you must have some question here.
I don't have a question, actually. Well, maybe I'll think of one in a bit, but I really enjoyed this talk. I actually just read a book or finished reading a book called The Forgetting Machine. Have you heard of it?
Yes.
It was very similar.
Well, tell the other group about it a little bit.
So The Forgetting Machine is a book, and it's very theoretical based, but it introduces neurons and like electrical impulses, and it starts off with a scientific perspective, and then later on in the book it poses theoretical questions like, we know what we are, like we're a collection of electrical impulses that are capable of many things. You could say even voluntary or involuntary movement, but we don't have any way of quantifying who we are. Like the thing that makes us our being is our memory, our personality, and our soul to an extent, and there's no way to quantify that, understand that. So you're missing like half the information of humankind. But yeah, it was very similar to your talk, so I thought it was really interesting, and I expanded from your talk on what I learned in the book. I'd recommend it though, if no one's read it. It's really short too, but it makes you question like everything. It's really cool.
Emerson, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a very interesting presentation, and I really enjoyed it. And I was trying to figure out a question, but at the moment, I don't really have anything to ask. I just find it extremely fascinating how, like when we didn't have all the machines that we have now, like all the imaging that we have now, people use their ways, use quite interesting and actually very straightforward ways to look at things. Like you mentioned how Leonardo studies the ventricles by injecting some sort of material that would harden and then shape the ventricles, and how straightforward that could be, and how similar that is, for example, when you make sculptures, when you make a model, you start with a base, with a model, and you pour resin or whatever to make the final sculpture. And it makes me think how a great mind like his would connect art and science and basically make his mold out of the brain. And it's really interesting how these methods for us may be quite weird and sort of unheard of, but actually they were very straightforward and very connecting different aspects, different mastery of topics like indeed art and science.
Yeah, I think Leonardo's ability to have sort of learned, for example, sculpture in Verrocchio's workshop, and some anatomy, for example, related to how to show the body, three-dimensional concepts related to that, and even maybe some anatomical explorations when he was in the Verrocchio workshop, allows him to sort of cross boundaries. And no one had thought about trying to find out what the ventricles look like in a three-dimensional way. But he obviously went over that particular knowledge impasse, was able to do a pretty good job at dealing with it. And it's hundreds of years later before the Monroe, the foramen of Monroe or the aqueduct of Sylvius is actually sort of identified, and he did it hundreds of years before. So again, it gives you some idea of the ability of the human mind to sort of deal with barriers and go beyond barriers if you have more of a humanistic type of education, multiple things, rather than just very sticking in one particular area. Renee, your thoughts? Thanks, Emerson.
I don't know how much. Thank you very much for your presentation. The first thing I would like to say, I think it was very interesting to see historical trait of evolution somehow of all the things related to the search of the soul, as they called it in the past times, and now probably consciousness and something else related to this. I'm very interested into this topic personally and well, scientifically, I could say. And I think about the professor, sometimes professors of psychology like to usually say that students are not that smart to keep them going on, forward on. But I think it's pretty brilliant to say that Da Vinci was a very creative man. And I do believe you have good grade. I don't like to quantify talent. That's why I don't like to say anything, any number or anything. That's absurd for me. But I'd like to say that probably this task, this project of finding the creative person is really enriching. And right now this talk has taught me to broaden my perspective on how to see consciousness, because I'm usually focused on one perspective. And probably people who don't know me don't know this, but it's important to see other ways to look at it, like with artificial intelligence, with other perspectives. I don't want to steal much time, so I'm just gonna end right now and let anybody else talk about this.
Benjamin, your thoughts?
This is more of a comment. Well, first, thank you. It was a very insightful lecture, and I definitely want to watch it like at least one or two times to get a true understanding of it. But I was just thinking, when you raised that question of, well, how do we define love, and is it really just a chemical thing, or is more into it? Remind me of how we are looking at the psychiatric disorders, because we initially thought that psychiatric disorders are purely something that is to be done with the mental health, and they're not really connected to the other parts of the body. But now we know that there's also a lot of physiology involved in it. So that was quite interesting for me to see and raise that question: what is really consciousness? What is really the soul out there? Is it just purely a chemical reaction, or there is something more into it? And the two books that I recently read, which they really talk about the whole mental health and how it's related to the physiology of the human being. One is obviously Listening to Prozac by Dr. Kramer, and the other one, The Inflamed Mind by, I think it was Edward Balmore, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, that was quite fascinating. And I think there's still a lot that we don't know, because the more we look into it, the more complex it gets, and definitely requires more research, more thought, and more experiment to truly understand what soul is and what consciousness really means.
Thanks, Benjamin. Abby.
Thank you very much, Professor. Not questions, but I would like to probe you a bit with some thoughts that you made me think of. One, you said Da Vinci said the eye as the window of the soul, and this reminded me of after you mentioned Descartes, who thought the pineal gland was the seat of the soul, which is kind of like an atrophied eye, right? So is there any connections you see there? And specifically with regards to also a recurrent theme of your presentation was dreams. And if, the pineal gland, I believe, has some connection to it. So maybe you can talk a bit about what did Da Vinci think about dreams? And yeah, because I think that may also bring us to the cybernetics of artificial intelligence. Can AI dream? So maybe just expand a bit more on that, please.
Well, one of the problems with the pineal issue was very quickly people pointed out that there are a number of animals that have a bigger pineal gland than humans do. And therefore, if the pineal gland was, for example, the seat of the soul, why do, animals, dolphins, many animals have very large pineal glands? Because they're associated with light, wake cycles, etc. And therefore, that particular almost mechanical type of theory that the brain is really a mechanical machine. But if you think about it, if you bring that forward a little bit to the artificial intelligence world, you can see why there's a little bit of interest in this sort of idea that maybe what we are is a series of sort of algorithms that are running inside a series of neurons. And these particular series of neurons run a particular algorithm, whether that algorithm has to do, for example, with, let's say, interpreting information or interpreting, what a particular face looks like, or a particular sound of a voice looks like and sounds like, and what it really means. And those systems are ways you can think about it, but how they actually work is much more difficult. The idea of the dreaming concept, people have some interest. They could read The Tides of Mind, because as Kayla said, this was interesting to me, because it brought really to the idea that each of us, in that funny time period between the time we go to sleep and the time we're just before sleep, our brain is functioning in very strange ways. It brings up ideas, concepts, everything else, and then is part of what we are, this sort of a hinterland, this land of dreaming. And obviously that comes from memory, right? I mean, you can't be dreaming unless the memory systems are putting information forward continuously and distributing it through the brain. And as I mentioned, if you have, for example, a very bad dream, you will suddenly wake up. And, so again, the concept that you can bring on consciousness by these sort of internal systems that are working. And related to the pineal gland, I mean, there are melatonin is associated, for example, with being able to sleep better, and people that have various types of psychological ADHD and other types of disorders are getting melatonin so they can sleep better. you can argue that there may be these circuits that are doing this. The circuits in each of us that are not only the circuits, for example, that keep your heart working, keep your breathing, and all this, but other circuits that are much more complicated sort of interactions with people. This concept of love, etc. The other thing that happened to me one time was that I gave this talk, and one of the gynecologists got up, happened to be from a medical group, and basically what he said was that you can have one egg split into two, and you can have two identical twins. You can have the egg split again, and you can have 4 identical twins, but it never goes beyond that in humans. So is there, after the sperm and egg get together, some limit to the idea of humanity? In other words, after a certain number of divisions, then whatever consciousness or whatever is, at least in our system, can't go forward. And so it was sort of an interesting concept that, that maybe there's only a certain limited number of divisions can occur in the egg to form humans, and after that, we just don't do it anymore. The actual programs run, and they have a running, and then when they're finished running, that's it. You're going forward, and we're not able to continue subdivide the system, because at some point the system doesn't produce a human being, conscious human being anyway. So there's some interest from that aspect.
But can I just probe you on that, just one? So what about the diseases like cancer? They're complex, they're adaptive, and they keep dividing. So what do you think we can link consciousness to cells or these complex systems?
Obviously, cancer cells are systems that are out of control. They're not functioning in a normal way. They're not controlled in a similar way that, let's say, that particular organ system should be controlled. So I think my own feeling would be that there probably is some truth in the idea that if we understood a little bit more about how actual cells control themselves, we probably would understand a little bit more about consciousness related to the human brain. Because, as you know, the vast majority, another interesting thing, since the time that you were conceived and the time that you were, let's say, 4 or 5 years old, your brain is putting on literally millions of cells every single day. And on top of that, it's making millions of connections every single day. Somewhere around the age of 5, almost don't produce any more cells. The brain is finished. Now, you can produce some cells later on associated with disease, etc. But there seems to be some type of a limit again. And so, again, this is an inbuilt system. This is a system that runs. And we suddenly have a stop sign that says, no more producing, no more neurons are going to produce. Yeah, you can produce all kinds of new connections. We're not getting any more cells, or very few more, considering what was happening when they were developing, etc. So again, sort of an interesting sort of interaction between the inner conscious and what I say conscious from that aspect of it. I don't know. I mean, I spent my life working on tumor cells. One part of my life working on tumor cells, and I think we're closer to understanding what's happened. I think, obviously the best way of preventing cancer is to not start it. And hopefully with some of these newer methods, maybe we can find these aberrant cells a little earlier. And we're able to do that, and we get a better handle on sort of eliminating the scourge of cancer from the face of the earth. We will see. Paulo.
So first of all, thank you so much, because it was really a pleasure to listen to this talk tonight. So I actually have 2 questions. The first one is, you mentioned that Leonardo has sort of located the senso comune at the level of the hypothalamus, right? So the hypothalamus and the pituitary, that are actually a brain area very much related to internal regulation and instincts. My first question is, to your knowledge, did Leonardo get the chance to perform experiments, lesioning or somehow with patients or dead cadavers that had lesions in those brain areas?
Now, I think what you have to remember is that we have about 6,500 pages of Leonardo's notes. The estimate is that we are missing about half. And that relates to the fact that if you look at Leonardo's notebooks, when his pupil Melzi, Francesco Melzi, inherited them, there were around over 40 of those books, because he labeled them A, B, C, D, all the way down to, when he ran out of letters, he did A, B, 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 etc. And we now have 12. So there's a huge amount of information we don't know about what Leonardo did. The second thing, that very first drawing, he must have done many drawings before that time, because you can see he already has nerves there, he already has all kinds of things there, and he already has the experiment there. And so if we had not had that piece, you would not have known that he even did that particular experiment, except there would be notes in his notebooks about it. But we wouldn't actually see the actual experiment and the drawings, etc. So part of it is the fact that we don't have all the information. That's part of it. The second thing is, this was an interesting part of Leonardo's interest, but it was in one way a small part of his interest. He was quite interested, for example, in the heart and how the heart worked and how the valves worked and motion fluids. And, I think Leonardo got to the end of that third phase, where he has the picture of the brain, he has the nerves, he has connections, he has the ventricles, and then probably he couldn't go too much further than that. That was sort of the limit that he could go to, because he didn't have the abilities to do other things. The second thing is Leonardo was not a physician. And although he was doing dissections in the basements of Santa Maria dei Fiori and other places in Florence and in Rome, etc., he, always had a little bit of a problem associated with the idea of getting cadavers, etc. The fact that he could actually get a cadaver and do a dissection of a woman who died in about 8 months during the pregnancy was rather remarkable, that he was able to do that. And if you read some of his notes, for example, associated with how difficult it was to do dissections, he did them at night. He did them all by himself. He almost never had students with him because he didn't want the students to get involved with whatever the authorities might want to do to them. He was powerful enough that he necessarily wouldn't get into real trouble. But when he was doing his last group of human dissections in Rome, he was called out to the Pope and basically stopped dissections. So, he was wandering a very tight line. Therefore, my gut feeling, Pablo, is he did do some of those experiments. I suspect that that animal you saw at the top was a dog, and he was doing experiments in dogs, and probably cutting nerves in dogs and doing things like that. But at the same time, he was a vegetarian, didn't like to hurt animals in any way, shape, or form. So it's hard to know how much of that he would have done. It's just very hard. It's a complex sort of issue from that point, but it's an interesting question.
And my second one was about your overall perception of the search of the soul, because you ended this presentation by saying the search continues. So my last question would be, what would you consider to be your current understanding of the soul by itself? I mean, we know that consciousness is encoded by frontal lobe, memory in hippocampus, emotions in amygdala. I mean, we know the complex, we know the neuroscientific idea, but we are still lacking one grounding, linking theory about how do these systems interact together. So I was curious about asking your perspective on this.
I'll go back a little bit to this idea of the fetus. Conceptually, is it, just for a second, think about this. You have an ovum, you have a sperm, you put together sort of this group of 46 chromosomes, and this conscious being occurs. And that conscious being not only is conscious, according to our definition, but can sort of explore consciousness. So it actually can explore the meaning of their own existence, as Ventura says. So my own gut feeling is that, and Rakai can maybe kick in on this too, the real question that I have difficulty with is, will computers become conscious? Because if computers actually will become conscious, this, to my own mind, puts the world at risk. Because they could clearly, these systems of computers could clearly, it's been written about many times in the dystopian world, figure out that humans are not very useful. Because they sort of destroy things, and they are clearly not a species that is given to love, affection, mostly given to war and other things. So if they become conscious, and especially if they can hook up to one another in a very effective way, then they could start asking some very interesting questions, which would be, why do we have these people around at all? Why don't we just have robots who can do this whole work for us and forget the human situation at all? And I'd like Rakai's comment on this too, because the other idea that it's an integrated system, that consciousness is really a flux, and so the animals are partially conscious, and et cetera, really does come to the idea that it's integrated to the system of humanity. And it's integrated to living systems. Consciousness is integrated into living systems. Systems can adapt and live, and are born with whatever systems are available for it. But I just don't know. My own gut feeling is at some point, maybe in your lifetimes, computer systems may get to be conscious. It's going to be scary to think about that. But in one way, if it is indeed true that you need a certain amount of sensory information and sensory sort of systems to distribute information to multiple different nodes of information to become conscious, then that's going to be a very interesting. Is it so, think about it. I mean, there are probably millions of Earths out in the solar system, and there might even be duplicate solar systems, right? There's no good reason why there should only be one. So then you have all these Earth-like areas, and then life could evolve in all those areas also. And so will it take the same form and shape? Will it develop a similar type of consciousness, or it will be a communal consciousness? Or we're one experiment. What would the other experiments be like? Because obviously they're out there. We just haven't interacted with them yet. But we will probably at some point. It'll be interesting. And what is our vision of these other species going to be? And the other thing that's a bit concerning is, what is the concept of God if suddenly another species arrives on our doorstep? How do we deal with that? Anyway, let's not get into that right now, but you can see the concept that we have here, that we're somehow unique, that we're somehow a unique species. It's rather remarkable that we exist at all. whether, asteroids have hit the Earth and planted various types of materials that have resulted in our evolution or not, whether we've been seeded from asteroids or seeded by other species, who knows, but at some point, our species is going to interact with other species, and then we'll have to see what happens there. Rakai, what do you think about this idea about the artificial intelligence concept and that computers will be conscious?
I was thinking about this for a long time. I think like AI needs data. So I think as long as we become able to provide our data, our thinking, the data about thinking to machines, like they can be very accurate replica of us, and like for many people it wouldn't be possible to differentiate between a computer and then a human. So I think like in future computers will become very similar to what human is, but in my opinion, again, like the difference with the like humankind is the creativity, in my opinion. Like we can change things like from scratch, kind of like tomorrow we can develop something and our life can be very different than today. And it's not possible with animals, for example. So I think the only thing missing would be with the AI is the creativity. Like they cannot change themselves like us. But as long as we provide the data that is changed by human, and we provide it to AI computer systems, they can update themselves and become similar, keep similar with us. Yeah, I think like in short, like except the creativity part, I think computers will become conscious.
Yeah, it would be interesting to think about it. A computer. I mean, a computer could design the David, for example, but could it create the David? Because then it takes someone who actually has to chisel it out and has to refine it and has to. And if a mistake is made, has to improve. It's a very complex sort of creativity. I mean, as I mentioned, my interest has always been associated with creativity and how creativity works. And I've always thought that there's really three phases of creativity. The first phase really probably occurred in Greek times. When you have Socrates, you have Plato, you have Aristotle, you have all that sort of whole area in the Greek time frame. But that was really focused on the idea that they developed an alphabet. And their alphabet was able to be used so other people could understand and repeat it, etc. The problem with the Egyptians and maybe the Babylonians and many of the other sort of groups that were developing before that time was that their alphabet or their way of writing wasn't such that it was easy to understand. It was very, very restricted to a certain number of scribes and groups like that, priests, etc. But the Greeks blew that open. And the second really time of creativity really happened to be at the time period of the Renaissance. And again, the idea of perspective, the idea that you could, and that happened to be associated with the printing idea, that you could print books and therefore people could actually have books and read them. And that's sort of a second sort of wave of creativity. And we may be in the third wave. The internet, and knowledge being spread all over the place. We may be in the third wave of the creative sort of arc. I don't know what is the fourth wave going to be then? But the first wave was the alphabet, the second wave was the books, the third wave was the internet. What's the fourth wave? There's some type of communication somewhere. Are we going to be hooked up to machines and have various sort of systems attached to our brains so we're much, much better? And that can be the fourth wave.
I think like storing the development is an important thing, kind of like as I think Benjamin mentioned, like Leonardo da Vinci had this amazing drawing skills, and that skill allowed him to like record his knowledge and like learning. So today, like we have a very big advantage with the technology. Everyone who contributes to like a knowledge can actually record it and then share it. I think that will like really like make things faster from now. Like it's in, things are being developed in geometrically, like extending geometrically right now with the technology. I think that will be the key of our like timeline.
Yeah, I think in my lifetime, the biggest changes have been, in truth, it's been the internet and the ability to carry a computer around, in your hand. That is an amazing change. Because before you basically had to look it up in books, or you had to have this huge library around to get all this knowledge. And now you can sort of get that knowledge from the internet, at least part of that knowledge from the internet, but not maybe all of it, but part of it. I just wonder if there are going to be time periods, when we're going to have some type of implants into humans, and they're able to sort of feed humans with information at a very much faster rate than we do at the present time. Maybe that will be the fourth wave. It'll be interesting. I don't know, Rakai. I think that I have a problem with the idea of love. I have a problem with the idea of human loving kindness, for example. There are some issues that I'm not sure that computers are going to be able to deal with very, very well, because there seems to be some inbred things in the system. For example, Canada geese, which you've all seen probably, made for life. Why? Obviously there is some evolutionary advantage to that. That's why it happens. It's sort of interesting, some of these things that as far as that is concerned. Anyway, Ali, your thoughts?
A lot of thoughts, to be honest. A lot of inspirations. I don't know how to distill it, but just thinking about the future and how computers and the internet have shaped our lives, I think humanity is at a point where we are generating so much data that is surpassing our brain's ability to store all that information and process all that information. So we turn to these machines to help us in making sense of what's happening around us. Now, I don't know that turning into these machines more and more often and giving them this ability through algorithms to make sense of data is actually going to allow them to become conscious, but it's definitely helping us understand the world better. And I think there is power in that. And I think we can leverage that ability of computers to understand our world better and hopefully get us out of the problems that we have buried ourselves into. But I really don't know how the future is going to unfold with computers becoming conscious and then realizing how much damage we've done to this planet and making some decisions that could end really badly for us. And just some other thoughts about the soul and the idea of God. It's also really, really powerful questions that it's very interesting that I've always been there from like dawn of time, from when humans could think and write. And the fact that we still don't have a empirical answer I think is really beautiful. It just shows that this search has maybe no destination until we like meet the creator. We just have to keep pursuing it, and it's the pursuit is what matters, and it's what allows us to generate all this knowledge and understand more about ourselves and our world. Those are just some thoughts.
Yeah, I think the important part is the continuing search, right? This is a continuing process. We're not at a precipice. We're not at some type of end. We're just, you could argue, at the beginning of the beginning. And I guess we'll see how we'll ever get to ending, whatever that ending is going to be. I think, though, when you think about this, we have to think that probably what all of you have to focus on is how do you find that sort of funny area which we call happiness? You know, how do you get to that stage where you're happy with the way you live and the way you interact with other people and have some type of, let's say, communal appreciation for the human race and what the human race could really become in the future. We worked at it really hard. That's sort of the important thing, I think. I personally do not think the computers are going to be conscious because I don't think they're going to be able to dream. I don't think that dreaming is involved with creativity. It's involved with taking the information that we have in our temporal lobes, that memory, and redefining it, changing it, altering it to make something completely new and different. And I'm not sure computers are going to be able to do that either. That's my thought about that. Mustafa.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Del Maestro. I have a couple of questions. Just a bit of a segue away back to the divine disease. Last week, Dr. Sal Mangione talked about how genius is associated with thickened corpus callosum and interhemispheric connectivity. I've read about some surgical treatments of epilepsy where the corpus callosum is actually severed, and sometimes in pediatric populations, they entirely sever it. So I was just wondering on what your thoughts are about this and this idea of a genius and the corpus callosum and the soul maybe, and maybe if Leonardo even have had seizures before too, right? Like, I just thought that was interesting.
Well, I think the reason that the corpus callosum is cut in seizure in seizure cases, not as much now as in the past because we have better medications, but the problem is that seizures can start in one hemisphere and very quickly spread to the other hemisphere. And therefore, that particular individual can be in a world of just continuous seizures. Cutting the corpus callosum limits the seizures to one side. And sometimes that means that that particular individual is still conscious, although he or she may be having seizures on one side of the body, but not necessarily having the loss of consciousness all the time. So that's one aspect of it. The second aspect of it, there are many things that make your corpus callosum get bigger. You know, music does it. I'm sure that people who are, doing very high levels of let's say, creativity or very high levels of mathematics, their corpus callosum is probably fairly big too. And there were some really good studies of individuals in the past. If you wanted to be a taxi driver in London, England, you had to basically memorize all the whole map and everything that was in it to pass. And those people developed large hippocampi in their temporal lobes. And so you can change your brain in multiple ways. There are ways of changing your brains. And I'm sure every time you see something really interesting or very novel, your brain probably changes. It probably develops new connections and new sort of linkages. And that's what learning is all about, all these new connections that we are developing all the time. And so I'm not altogether sure that just because the corpus callosum gets, let's say, thicker, basically means that you have more communication from the one side and the other side of the brain. For example, do we know, for example, that very creative people have very large corpus callosum? I would think there'd be two reasons to think that may or may not be true. There are certain very creative people who have only been involved in very, very single types of things. Like, for example, Cézanne painted the same area in France a couple of hundred times. Same, almost exactly the same area. He just kept painting it, because he didn't feel he could get it right. And one of the reasons, for example, that Leonardo was said to have not finished his work is that he was looking for perfection, and he couldn't, to his mind, get there. So, sort of interesting from that aspect of it. Now, your second question, Mustafa.
Right, yeah. Thank you for your answer. Very interesting. this is relating to this idea of dreaming and this comment that you made to Ali's question about artificial intelligence and how really your opinion about how the machines can't be conscious because they can't dream, essentially, in one aspect of it. So I guess my question is, and it's going to be a very difficult question to sort of comprehend, if a person passes away, can their soul still dream? It's a very strange question, but
Well, Plato thought that, you know, the soul was sort of a permanent fixture and had persistence over time. There are multiple types of religious beliefs that believe that, right? That you're in one state and then you go to another state, then you go to another state. And therefore the soul could clearly travel within those different states. The other argument you could make would be, are the genes that are associated with what we call the soul, in other words, how to integrate your perceptions of the world and how you, for example, are involved in your emotional reactions, etc. Are those inbuilt in the genetic material that we have? And if they're inbuilt in the genetic material that we have, you know, that could be at least one answer to the question, right? That they're an inbuilt type of system. So, you know, I think there are a couple things. When I started, I wrote the first, I mean, I'd been working on this for a while, but I wrote the first paper on this about 20 some odd years ago. And at that time, you know, it was relatively straightforward. You know, I looked into the Greeks, I looked into, you know, the Middle Ages, St. Augustine, and all this sort of other aspects of it, Thomas Aquinas, and their ideas. Later on, I became much more interested in how the genes work, for example, and how they're somehow associated with the development. And lately, I've been much more interested, for example, in this whole idea of consciousness and what does it mean to be really conscious, and the importance of that sort of idea. It may be that we don't ever find the answers, but I think that's part of the search, right? Part of the search is moving from one stage to another and trying to find some more clarity in whatever you're looking for. So I think I guess my suggestion would be, for me, this particular search has been fun. You know, it's expanded my ideas and thinking about various aspects of life. And, you know, it's provided me with talks, giving talks in various areas and lots of ideas back and forth. And it's helped me grow a little bit. As I've gotten older, I've been a little bit more interested in the ideas of love and caring and how they're interacting, for example, in the human condition. So I've gone from this sort of idea of the frog experiment to a much more complex interaction of what the brain is all about and what the real purpose of us may be. Now you can get spiritual if you like too. One thing I will tell you, if I told you the experience I had related to operating on a patient awake, if I told you that experience, because near the end of my career, I was operating on a patient who was awake, and she was getting more and more and more stressed. And when they do that, it becomes very, very difficult. And I just, you know, I knew she was very religious, and I just asked her to pray. And, you know, very quickly, almost everybody in the operating room, the nurses, the anesthesiologists, the residents, almost all started to pray with her. Very, very quickly, she was completely settled down. We went on with the operation, finished the operation. So despite all the information we have about drugs, on ways to keep people quiet, etc., the fact that a person can just pray and get to that level of sort of some serenity gives you an idea that we have so much more to learn about what humanity really is. It's so much more to learn, and it's not in the test tube. It's a communication sort of idea from that. All right, I think that's enough for now. Next week, Dr. Brian, who's really the world's expert on Sir William Moser, is going to talk about what we can learn from Sir William Moser. So some of that discussion may be more related to what we learned from mentors and other things associated with that. So thanks everybody for being on. And maybe I can talk with Mustafa here for a second. Ali, if you want to stay on and Mikhail, that will be fine too, just for a second. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a nice weekend.
You too.